I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
Francis Ford Coppola is a fearless filmmaker, a pioneer in cinema, and a juggernaut when it comes to pop culture. He's made some of the greatest films of all time, and he makes wine too. He created a cinematic crime family on the screen, and created a real-life cinematic family in real life. The Godfather, The Conversation, Godfather 2, Apocalypse Now, and he even wrote Patton. I always forget that he wrote Patton. Whenever I watch Patton, I read the credits, I'm like, oh yeah, Francis Ford Coppola. And he won an Oscar for the script. So how does a man go from making this to this?
Good.
Lately, it feels like Francis Ford Coppola is more known for his wine than his cinema. But let's change that. Let's go back into the jungle and learn what the f*** happened to Francis Ford Coppola. But to truly understand Mr. Coppola, we must start at the beginning of his life when he was a child. A very sickly child. He had polio at age 9 and was paralyzed for a while. So young Francis would pass the time by watching lots of television, listening to the radio, playing with his tape recorder, and putting on puppet shows. He took advantage of his situation and used it to exercise his imagination. Francis loved the theater, and his passion for theater soon evolved into cinema. He was part of that Hollywood New Wave movement, which was led by film students like Lucas, Spielberg, Milius, Scorsese, De Palma, the greats. And Francis was their unofficial gang leader. The Godfather, in a way. It was a cinematic renaissance, and nobody realized it at the time. They were just a bunch of nerds with cameras, trying to make their silly movies. But these nerds would change Hollywood and change the world. And none of it would have happened if it wasn't for Francis Ford Coppola. I'm serious, you guys.
I know it was you, Fredo. You broke my heart. You broke my heart.
Francis revolutionized the way filmmakers treat film school. He was the first film student to have his thesis be a feature film. Coppola paved the way for students to become professionals. And he worked with Roger Corman. Yes, the Roger Corman worked with the Francis Ford Coppola. He was his assistant. He did everything for him, even washed his car. And this got him his first directing gig, Dementia 13. And this got him a job directing Finian's Rainbow. He wanted to shoot on location in Kentucky, but the studio made him shoot on a Hollywood lot. He was an artist. He could not be controlled. Francis needed his freedom and independence. And so did his pal George. They wanted to create art. They wanted to make a film as they traveled around the country and incorporate real life with the story. And they did just that. It was an interesting mixture of documentary and fictional filmmaking. And the result was The Rain People. They just drove around and was like, hey, that's happening, go film that, put that in the movie, do this. And they let life make the movie. They built a small production studio in a trailer as they drove around the country, filming while editing. And they realized that they didn't need the big Hollywood studios to make movies. They could do it themselves. So Francis and George Lucas, BFFs, paving the way for future filmmakers. And Francis believed in George Lucas and produced his first films, THX 1138 and American Graffiti. Then his world changed forever when he was given an offer that he couldn't refuse, The Godfather. But he actually did refuse it, at first. Francis Ford Coppola didn't want to do The Godfather, and honestly he did it for the money, but eventually fell in love with the story after rereading the book. He always wanted Marlon Brando, and everyone said that he wouldn't agree to do it, but he did. And there was a lot of talk about how this newcomer Al Pacino was horribly miscast, but he wasn't. And they said that nobody wanted to watch a movie that was so dark, both in terms of violence and in shadows. The studio was concerned that you couldn't see anything. But the glory of The Godfather hides in the shadows, in the darkness. And there was even talk that audiences would find the film boring. Plus, they were worried that Coppola couldn't properly direct the violent scenes. So the studio considered hiring a violence director to come in. Whatever that is. Which may be why Francis kind of went over the top with some of the violence. But hey, we like movie violence because it's not real. Real violence is not good. But of course, Francis proved everyone wrong, and all the concerns are now what everyone praises about the film. It's so wonderfully lit, they now say. The slow burn suspense is so exciting, they say. And Marlon is marvelous, and Pacino is brilliant, they say. Now, the Godfather film set was a notorious disaster. Francis suffered everything from difficult actors to the real-life mafia getting involved. But Francis was able to control the chaos, and he used creative editing techniques and clever rewrites to make all these little happy accidents on set improve the film. Like when he inserted a scene of this character nervously practicing his lines. Because in real life, the actor was so nervous that he would flub his lines, acting alongside, a legend like Marlon Brando. And after take, after take, after take, they had no good footage. So to explain why the character couldn't get a clear sentence out, Francis filmed a scene of him rehearsing, thus adding to the story and the character. So the horrible acting became perfect.
Don Corleone, I am honored and grateful that you have invited me to your daughter's wedding. On the day of your daughter's wedding.
And that is why Coppola is considered one of the greatest greats. Of all the greats. Simply the best. And speaking of the best, it won Best Picture, but lost Best Director to Cabaret for some reason. It won Best Screenplay, and Marlon won Best Actor for playing Don Corleone, but he didn't show up. The Godfather was a massive hit, and became one of the highest grossing films of all time. And it had an enormous impact on pop culture, and real life. Like the real-life mafia now uses the term Godfather. Godfather the movie came first, now the real-life mafia says it. It doesn't get more influential than that. He made another film in between Godfathers called The Conversation, his personal favorite film of his own. It won the Golden Palm at Cannes, and many don't talk about this film because it's sandwiched in between The Godfathers, and often overshadowed. But The Conversation is one of the finest pieces of cinema to ever grace the silver screen. It's wonderfully edited, and Gene Hackman? It's more like Gene can act, man. The film is so good that the studio was begging Francis for a Godfather sequel. And of course, Francis originally declined the director's chair for part 2. He actually wanted to hand this gig over to his pal Marty. But after some $1 million negotiating, Francis agreed, and we got another amazing film that he didn't want to make. So he threw himself into The Godfather Part 2, and at early screenings the reception was poor. So Francis made some quick cuts in the editing room, and eventually audiences warmed up to this powerful sequel/prequel. It's another great film about the American dream, family, killing people. He had another classic on his hands. And here's another perfect example of the genius of Francis Ford Coppola. Right here. Look at how he handled the final scene in Part 2. The film ends with a flashback to happier times for the family, when certain characters are still alive. It's a bittersweet ending. And originally Marlon Brando was to return, but of course he flaked out. And Francis had to scramble to figure out what to do with a Brando-less scene that's centered around Brando. Once again, the happy accident made the scene even more powerful. On the spot, Francis rewrote the scene to be a surprise party for Big Papa Don. The family is preparing for the party and talking about the Don as if he's, too important to feature on the screen. He's almost godlike. You the audience, you're not worthy of seeing Don Corleone. That's how important the character is, and that's what the film needed. His absence creates a mythical presence for this iconic character. Sometimes cinema is what you don't see, and Francis knows that. It's genius. Coppola finally won the Best Director Oscar for Godfather Part 2, and it won Best Picture again. And Robert De Niro won Best Supporting Actor for playing Don Corleone, but he also didn't show up. Plus, The Conversation and The Godfather Part 2 were at the Oscars the same year. It was the Francis versus Francis show. He was competing with himself, and he won. And I guess he also lost, but take the win, Francis. The Godfather Part 2 is one of the few sequels that many say is better than the original. I don't like to rank them, I'm just gonna say tie, yay! Everyone's a winner. And a loser. So you think a filmmaker with the type of success as Francis Ford Coppola could do whatever he wanted at that time, and studios would be throwing him money, right? Right? No, wrong! His next film was so controversial that even after The Conversation and Two Godfathers, Francis could not get financial support, so he paid for it himself with his own millions. Luckily, he had a lot of millions, but still, it was his own money and he used a lot of it, like all of it. And he paid with more than just money. He paid with his blood, his sweat, his tears, and his entire fucking soul. It was the most ambitious film ever made. Apocalypse Now.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
The film is a loose adaptation of Heart of Darkness, but set in the Vietnam War. And remember, this was during the real Vietnam War, so tensions were high, which is the main reason why nobody wanted to support this film. At that time, the idea was crazy. I mean, it's still crazy. And the film set was hell. It was chaos wrapped in expensive napalm. Shot on location in the Philippines, which was in the middle of a civil war, so they had real warfare to worry about. Long story short, it's the inspiration for Tropic Thunder, but more intense and less funny. Coppola originally took on this project so he can make a big Hollywood blockbuster, so that then he would have some extra spending cash to make his art house indies. But slowly, this big Hollywood war movie, it turned into a humongous art house indie flick. It turned into something more than just a movie. It was as if the film took on a life of its own, and forced Francis to play God, even though he's just a puny human.
My film is not about Vietnam.
C'est pas au sujet du Vietnam.
It is Vietnam.
C'est le Vietnam.
It's what it was really like. It was crazy.
Francis thought this film would kill his career and literally kill him. Production delays were costly, and Coppola was scared, even depressed. He was constantly on the verge of a breakdown. His sanity was at risk. He even spoke of shooting himself. With a gun. Not a camera. And Brando was difficult, again, even more so than usual. And the original leading man, Harvey Keitel, was replaced after weeks of shooting. That's expensive. Many of the actors were tripping on LSD, smoking that Mary Jane, and taking speed. And often their helicopters were taken away to fight communist rebels in real life, in a real war. The sets were destroyed by typhoons, and if it wasn't raining, it was really, really hot. Rumor has it there were real tribal headhunters in the film. And Martin Sheen had a heart attack. And Coppola lost 40 pounds, plus there was real-life animal sacrifice going on. The film is madness. Brilliant madness. Brilliant, beautiful madness. I think Marlon said it best. And not everybody loves it, but the film has gone down as one of the greatest films of all time in the eyes of most cinephiles. Like I said before, it's more than a movie. Whatever it is, it's a masterpiece. And I know I throw that word around a lot, but Apocalypse Now is a masterpiece. Great visuals, great music. Apocalypse Now, that's what I call music. Volume Redux, that's what I always say. Speaking of music, the next thing he did was a musical. Always taking chances and experimenting, Francis did the unexpected and took on a completely different genre with a fabulous song and dance motion picture. It's called One from the Heart. He was back to his old theater roots, but the film failed and he owed the bank a huge amount of money, and he was forced to put his production studio up for sale. After this $25 million film made less than $1 million at the box office. Sorry, Francis. One of my favorite stories about Francis Ford Coppola is how he helped produce legendary filmmaker Akira Kurosawa's Kagemusha. When the studio could not meet the budget demands of this epic, Francis Ford and George Lucas stepped in to help the man who inspired him. I mean, you gotta help him, he's Akira, the director, not the anime. Francis Ford Coppola's next film was The Outsiders, which features an incredible ensemble cast of young Hollywood, and even though many loved this film, Francis was disappointed, and he felt that his direction was misguided. He tried to make it kind of an homage to Gone with the Wind, but that just fell flat. And what he was really trying to do was make an art film for kids, but that didn't work. So he tried again, with his next project, Rumblefish. Here he could fix what he didn't like about The Outsiders. It was a more experimental take on the coming-of-age story, and it's shot on gritty black and white, during the age of color, which means this is an artsy-fartsy film. And it has scenes with bits of color thrown in there, so you know that this is really an artsy-fartsy film. Extra artsy-fartsy, that's how I like it. Then came The Cotton Club, and this is actually a great film. But the studio was worried that this film had too many gosh darn black people and too much gosh darn tap dancing. So they asked Francis Ford Coppola to re-edit and cut that stuff down, which is difficult because it's a film about black people tap dancing. So the film that was released wasn't exactly Francis Ford Coppola's true vision. But he recently released a remastered edition of The Cotton Club, which features 20 minutes of new footage. Check it out. Then there was the fun film Peggy Sue Got Married. It's fun. I like it. It has Nicolas Cage, his nephew. Then there was the drama Gardens of Stone, but that didn't get very good reviews. And Tucker, A Man in His Dream, was pretty good. Francis Ford Coppola took on that project because he could relate to the character's drive, but replaced cars with movies. Then there was New York Stories, 3 stories, one from Woody Allen, one from Martin Scorsese, and one from Francis. I mean, all those guys are good filmmakers, so, you know, it's good. It's good. And then came Godfather 3, which sucks.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
It was a sequel that was made decades later, for no reason, and disappointed audiences everywhere. The Pope is in it, there's lots of opera, Joe Mantegna, and he cast his daughter Sophia, who's a great filmmaker, but not a great actress. And too much of the film relied on her being believable, which she was not. But Andy Garcia's good. He's good. He bites a guy's ear. But for the most part, you can skip part 3. By this time in Francis Ford Coppola's career, the only predictable thing about him was that he's completely unpredictable. And his next film was the infamous Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now I love and hate this film. I love the look, I love Gary Oldman, I love the direction, but 90s Keanu and 90s Winona are horribly miscast in this, and it ruins the entire film. I'm fans of both of those actors, but they need to be in the right movies, and this is not the right movie. Francis should have known that, but he cast them because he wanted to appeal to young audiences. And be like, look, this Dracula has fresh Hollywood faces in it, movie stars. You youngsters like movie stars, right? This movie has them. That didn't work. Which is a shame because this Dracula film is unlike any other film at that time. Because it didn't use filmmaking techniques from that time. That's right, in order to remain pure, Francis shot this film in 1992 as if it was the silent era. Because artsy-fartsy reasons. You see, Bram Stoker wrote the book Dracula around the same time that cinema was being invented. So in the twisted mind of Francis Ford, this meant that he should shoot this major Hollywood motion picture with technology from the turn of the century. Now that's what I call retro. It was a completely insane decision to make. But Francis was crazy enough to do it. We're talking no green screens, no computers, just celluloid with multiple exposures, miniatures, primitive movie magic trickery, and even techniques that they just had to invent on set, on camera, on the spot. I'm talking no post-production effects in this film. This was followed by Jack, with Robin Williams, who plays the world's hairiest 10-year-old. And I saw this film when I was around that age. Somewhere around there. And I liked it because it was Robin Williams and it was the 90s. And then years later I discovered that Jack was a Francis Ford Coppola film. And I was shocked. It took me years to recover. How does a man go from directing Brando and Pacino and The Godfather to directing Bill Cosby farting in a treehouse with a bunch of children? And Robin Williams is one of those children, even though he's a big adult man. Yes! I guess everyone was hoping that this was going to be the new Big, but critics hated it. It's a very unusual family film. And there's actually a real disease that's kind of like this, so it's just weird. I don't know. Do you know Jack? You don't know Jack. Then he took on the John Grisham legal drama, The Rainmaker, and Grisham was pleased with Francis's adaptation of his novel. So that's nice. And I'm not exactly sure what went on here, but for some reason Francis Ford Coppola took over the production of Supernova. Does anyone remember Supernova? Supernova. And some sources credit him as the director and some don't. Some say it was Walter Hill who dropped out, so it's weird. It's one of those Alan Smithy things. Or should have been. This bit of Coppola's filmography has always puzzled me. I mean, Supernova? Really? Then in 2001, he released Apocalypse Now Redux, where he added 40 minutes of deleted scenes to a hella long movie and made it even hella longer. And then years later, in 2019, he would release Apocalypse Now Final Cut. And this time he removed those 40 minutes. And so there's a theatrical version of Apocalypse Now, there's a Redux version of Apocalypse Now, there's a bootleg first assembly cut of Apocalypse Now, and there's an Apocalypse Now Final Cut. Speaking of Final Cut, he used Final Cut to edit Youth Without Youth, and I'm using Final Cut to edit this. Youth Without Youth seemed promising, and gave us all hope for Coppola's comeback, but the film did very poor with critics yet again. Then he made Tetro, which was much better received. The combination of Coppola and Vincent Gallo is intriguing, and the black and white cinematography is absolutely mesmerizing. I would consider this one his minor comeback, back on track. Ford says this is the type of film that he always wanted to make as a young man, but became sidetracked with all his fame, fortune, and success.
How could you do this to me? My story gets you. Where'd you get...
And then came a horror film called Twixt, which many call his worst film yet. And I haven't seen this film, so I can't judge, but I'm gonna judge. This looks horrible. This is a Francis Ford Coppola movie? Are you kidding me? I am so judgmental. But you can be too. Comment your comments in the comments. And these past few Francis Ford flops has raised the controversial question. Is directing a young man's game? Is cinema a place where there's no country for old men? Is there an age limit on making good movies? There are exceptions, of course. Not everyone could be Clint Eastwood. But you know what I'm saying. There's a handful of legendary directors out there who, over the years, have let us down. Yes, and not everyone can make a perfect movie every time, but we're noticing a pattern. And Francis Ford Coppola is one of those directors. So I ask the question, should a director quit while they're ahead at a younger age? Or should they risk ruining their legacy with lesser films in their senior years? And this reason right here, this is exactly why Tarantino says he's going to stop at number 10. So what do you think? Should Francis keep going? Should he keep making movies until he dies? Or should he just stop? Right now, and hope that we only remember his earlier work. Comment your comments in the comments! And then there's Coppola's unmade magnum opus, Dream Project, Megalopolis. It's an epic film about one man trying to rebuild New York City into a utopia after a horrible disaster. And Francis has actually admitted to taking Hollywood studio films like Jack or The Rainmaker so that he could finance his future Megalopolis masterpiece. So the only reason Jack and The Rainmaker even exist is because of this film, which hasn't even been made. The project keeps getting shelved due to rewrites. And after 9/11, the subject matter became a little sensitive. But it seems like Coppola is going to try to rebuild his rebuilding story once again. According to IMDb, it's been announced, and Jude Law has been cast. So let's see. I hope it actually gets made. The thing that really sticks out to me about Francis Ford Coppola is that he doesn't look back on his filmmaking with pleasant memories. It was nothing but pain and stress for him.
It's just, it's not in the cards that we're not going to finish the movie.
He's made really, really good movies, but movies have not been good to him. He's actually made more money on wine than films. And filmmaking is all about passion. You shouldn't do it unless you love it. You have to love it. And Francis has admitted to actually losing his passion for film once his films started getting popular. He's like a hipster that hates a band once they get famous. So he needed to take a break from movies and enjoy other aspects of life.
I reached the point where I just became, you know how sometimes when you feel very personal towards something and then you see everyone pursuing it, you know, you need maybe to get away from it a little bit. And so the last few years I find that I have really been more interested in reading or riding or going to a horse race or a baseball game.
And recently Francis has been in the news, in the mainstream media, because Bob Mueller's lawyers or something suggested that clips from Godfather Part 2 should be played in the courtroom of Roger Stone's trial to make a point about something. It always interests me to see cinema affect real life, especially politics, no matter if it's the left or the right. It's just great to hear people talk about The Godfather in the news.
Do you think the prosecutors are right? They should be able to play your film in this case?
If it's relevant to the case, and I mean, Godfather has become part of the culture. From my point of view, anyone who would take a stuff from a fictional gangster picture and put it in real life, that's not behavior. The behavior in The Godfather is not behavior I recommend.
And Francis Ford Coppola agrees with Marty about Marvel movies not being cinema, but he takes his opinion a little further and calls the entire genre despicable. He claims that audiences learn nothing from these big-budget superhero movies, and he finds it pointless to keep making the same movies over and over and over again. But I don't know how many Marvel movies he's seen. Do you have Disney Plus, Francis? You can use my cousin's girlfriend's password. He loves cinema, but he hates making movies. And how could someone be so good at something that they hate? He's cursed with talent in a field that he now despises, but still loves. It's a strange, complicated relationship. Thanks to Francis Ford Coppola's curse of talent, we now have some wonderful films. And some wonderful wine. I actually just chugged a bottle right before recording this, if you couldn't tell. He continues to make wine in Napa Valley, and he's just enjoying life. So guys, you shouldn't worry about what the f*** happened to Francis Ford Coppola, because he doesn't. So go pour yourself a glass, the finest Coppola wine, grab some spaghetti with the meatballs, and grab your favorite Francis Ford Coppola film, sit back and enjoy. And stop giving a f*** about what the f*** happened to Francis Ford Coppola.